Hello and welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host as always, Marcus Sadu. And today we've got Marty Kendall on the show. Marty is a nutrient optimization expert. So he really tries to delve into the details around maximizing the amount of nutrients that you're eating per calorie. And we had a really good chat on nutrient density. I just want to give you guys a little bit of a heads up. Towards the end of the interview, Marty and I dig into what he eats on a daily basis, so his personal diet. And I just want to say that his diet is very low calorie, and you don't necessarily have to be that low calorie in order to lose fat, but his goal personally is to maximize nutrient density in the diet while minimizing calories. And the reason his calorie intake is so low at the moment is because he is in a fat loss phase and he is maximizing his nutrient density per calorie. So I just wanted to give you guys that little heads up, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Today, I'm pumped to have the nutrient optimization guy himself, Marty Kendall, on the show. Thanks for coming on, my man.
Hey, absolute pleasure. Great to be here.
So, Marty, I originally became aware of your work via Rob Wolf, and I've been following you ever since. So for the folks who aren't familiar with you quite yet, can you let us know how you got into all this nutrition stuff to begin with?
I'm married to type 1 diabetic, so I suppose I was motivated to try and understand how food affects blood sugar, and that's really helped my wife Monica with improving her energy levels and a whole lot of health complications, and really she's thrived through that. But I suppose following through that with my journey, just trying to implement that into my life, and not everything that works for a type 1 diabetic to optimize their blood sugars works for fat loss and general optimization. So it's been a journey from there to try and say, okay, in my life, my family's life, how do we use nutrition to improve their health and vitality and fat loss and life optimization? As an engineer, it's sort of the intersection of how do we optimize nutrition. And people have responded really well to that sort of angle of, it's not just the old school nutritionist, the doctor, and what they've been taught. It just brings us a fresh angle, which is fun, and I enjoyed sharing that.
Yeah, man, the nutrient density stuff is really cool. So for starters, how would you define nutrient density, and then why should folks want to know about it?
It's basically the amount of nutrients per calorie, and especially the harder to find nutrients. So some nutrients are really easy to find in your diet, depending on what sort of diet you're following, but there's a bunch that are also harder to find that you need to try and pursue. So nutrient density focuses on the harder to find nutrients from real food. So we look at what you're currently eating, what the nutrient profile is, and then try to optimize your diet to say these are the foods that you need to eat more of to improve your satiety, energy levels, mitochondrial function, etc., etc. So I was just talking to you before about how recently did a challenge where we said, here's a new tool, Nutrient Optimizer, have a crack at optimizing your diet. People came for the weight loss and got into the nutrient density and loved it, and got really enthralled with chasing those micronutrients, and went, wow, look at the weight I'm losing. I'm feeling great. My energy levels are fantastic, and this is like nothing else. So it has a lot of positive benefits in terms of satiety and actually guiding you towards real whole food that leads to vitality and health, it seems.
Love that, man. Now, touching on the harder to find nutrients, with more recent agricultural processes, we've had some decreases in the nutrient status of our food. So what are the most common nutrients that we're getting less of now than we were before via alternative farming practices?
Yeah, that's really important. Done a lot of looking into the long-term changes in the nutrient profile of our food, and it's definitely the magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium, B12, those sort of things that have decreased through, I think, mass agriculture, mass fertilization. You look at when fertilization kicked in back in the 30s and 40s, a lot of those nutrients that are not supplemented, are not part of the fertilizer profile, really diminished, and therefore you have to get more and more calories to get the same amount of nutrients you would have before. And then around maybe 1977, where the dietary guidelines kicked in, vitamins like B12 particularly have dropped as a consequence, I think, of more of a plant-based, agriculture-based sort of dietary approach. So those things have changed, and we need to eat more calories to get the nutrients we would have got before all those things happened. So just over the last 50 to 100 years, our nutrient profiles have massively changed.
Right. So those are the common nutrients that we're missing out on potentially. Now, I have all my clients, my fat loss clients specifically, favor a single to minimal ingredient whole foods approach because I would say it's the healthiest and the most satiating way to eat. But there are a few thoughts thrown around, like the protein leverage hypothesis, among other ideas. So how is it that we're able to consume less calories and yet feel more satiated via whole foods as opposed to eating more calories and feel less satiated via hyper-palatable options? Do we know some of the mechanisms at play here?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Fascinating rabbit hole question. I think when you look at the seasons from a paleo sort of perspective, we would have had different food profiles in different environments. In winter, we would have had more of that fat and protein which looks like a keto, low carb type diet. In summer, we would have had the grains, where you would have had the harvest and everything that you could get off the trees. In spring, you've more of got a protein sparing modified fast sort of protein and lean animals that you would have been able to hunt and gather after winter. And then in autumn, you've got this amazing profile of more hyperpalatable foods, the nuts and those sort of things that you look at acorns and those sort of things that fatten squirrels up for winter, and the particular profiles that happen during the year, and particularly our modern agricultural environment gives us that fat and carbohydrate together all the time, which seems to be this amazing profile for minimizing satiety and maximizing intake, which is really amazingly yummy and addictive, and we love having it, and whenever it's available we keep on eating it and we can't stop. And when the cookie's on the bench, we're just programmed to consume it and eat it until we can't stop. So understanding those mechanisms, I think you can only have so much protein before your body says, no, I can't easily convert that to energy. Can you please stop? You've only got so much space in your body for carbohydrate. You've only got so much space for glycogen storage, and to convert that to fat, there's a level of lost energy and inefficiency. When it comes to just guzzling pure fat, I think there's probably a larger storage capacity. So at the analysis, when we've looked at the satiety analysis, it seems that fat to satiety, when you remove protein, doesn't really work, that you can have a lot of fat before satiety kicks in. But when you've got protein and fat together, that is harder to overeat. So there's different mechanisms and different food profiles, and you can optimize with that understanding to make sure you're not in that middle zone of hyperpalatable carb plus fat. Right,
which all the most delicious foods are. A low protein,
basically.
High carb, high fat.
It's the perfect formula for junk food and hyperpalatable food that everything in the center aisles of your supermarket is based on. So
totally. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with Stefan Guillenet's work. He's been on the podcast a few times, and we talked about how the brain seeks out protein, starch, sugar, fat, salt, and umami, which equates to caloric density in a pre-modern food environment. So the brain doesn't necessarily sense vitamin and mineral status, or at least we can't taste vitamins and minerals. So how do our taste buds factor in as far as what foods we seek out and how that relates to satiety?
Yeah, wow, that's fascinating. It's interesting, Stefan, on Twitter, he's fairly cynical and science-based, but when he saw my stuff on satiety and some of the charts I was sharing, he said, oh, wow, that really aligns with what I've been talking about and what he talks about in his book, that it's that hyperpalatable food of the combination of fat and carbs reduces satiety and helps people to eat more, and actually got in and helped me edit the article and gave some good feedback on that satiety article that I've got on the blog. So, Stefan has been in contact and sort of in alignment in that. But you look at the protein leverage hypothesis just basically indicates that when we get enough protein, our appetite switches off. But I think the same thing is happening to a degree. You look at salt. We've done analysis on sodium and find a similar sort of thing. When you get enough sodium, your appetite sort of drops down and the overall intake drops down. I think vitamins like potassium and some other things that tended to be plentiful in the diet before agriculture and before we domesticated grains were probably easier to get, so we don't have that trigger to say, yeah, I'm craving potassium right now. But at the same time, I think subconsciously we still have that and we still have those needs. And if we can basically actively say, yeah, well, we do need more potassium, magnesium, calcium, or whatever you're currently missing in your diet, and you can tailor it and tweak it to focus on those nutrients specifically to make sure you get a well-rounded, balanced diet, which basically just ends up looking like whole food that's colourful and looks amazing. But yeah, this is just a way of quantitatively optimizing it to make sure you're actually getting it and not just going, yeah, I eat paleo, and paleo can mean anything, keto can mean anything. It can be every food trend gets debaucherized basically by commercialized industry, and all of a sudden you got paleo comfort foods and everybody's getting fat and everybody's eating keto was great when everybody was just moving away from hyperpalatable processed sugar, but then all of a sudden everybody's going keto's butter and bulletproof coffee and
bacon and cheese all day.
Yeah, and somehow that no longer works for them either. And yeah, every food trend tends to end once people find a way to hack it to just eat more. And this is a way of say, well, if we quantify our real food using this mechanism, then we're going to get a good profile that is hard to hack with junk food that is not good for us.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, man. Now, some of the clever listeners might be thinking, well, why don't I just take like a greens powder, a multivitamin, or simply supplement with certain nutrients? Can you let us know some of the differences between getting nutrients from whole food versus in supplement form?
Yeah, a whole plethora of thoughts there, but I suppose the vitamins by themselves just don't tend to give you the same response, the same benefits. I mean, they've shown, Chris Kresser talks a lot about calcium supplementation just doesn't give the same response. They've found that vitamin D doesn't give the same dosage response when it's taken out and isolated, and it just seems to be the whole food matrix that benefits us. We get much greater benefits from actually eating a food. Maybe it's not just the vitamin D, maybe it's not just the omega-3 that we can isolate and put in a pill and put in a package and sell on Amazon. It's the whole matrix of the food together. It's not that isolated nutrient all by itself, but foods that contain all those nutrients together tend to benefit us a lot more. And then the bioavailability and the complementarity balance. There's a lot of micronutrient interactions and different ratios of micronutrients between calcium and magnesium and sodium, potassium. And if you don't get all those things optimized at the same time, then you're not going to get all the benefits of those nutrients by just taking them in a pill. So just ordering $200 worth of pills on Amazon is probably not going to cut it. And you don't see people, like there was a whole Soylent craze a while ago that was just basically vitaminized gruel. And, that was fascinating, but you didn't see people going, wow, I look amazing and I'm thriving because this is all I've eaten. I can live on it, I can survive. Doesn't taste good, don't love it, but I can survive. But nobody got really fit and thriving from just that food.
Yeah, totally. And I think something that you alluded to is that like nature has sort of figured this stuff out, right? Like all these foods have these combinations and specific ratios for a certain reason. And if we sort of trust in that, it tends to, things seem to fall in place.
Yeah. And the more I dig into this, the more you realize we don't know. We're just scratching the surface, particularly of nutrient density and how those nutrients interact. And so much if you get food that is in its natural form as found in nature, you tend to thrive a whole lot better.
Totally, man. Yeah, that's really exciting stuff coming down the pipeline there. Now, I've noticed with myself back in the day, as well with my clients now, that the taste buds tend to adapt rather quickly when moving from a hyperpalatable diet to a predominantly whole foods approach. But there does seem to be some lag time in there. I've sort of seen, maybe 5 to 14 days, I'd say, with these simpler foods. They taste sort of bland because the taste buds have been bombarded with processed foods. Is this something that you've seen with folks as well as they shift towards a more nutrient-dense diet?
Yeah, there's definitely a change in bliss point from people who are used to eating hyperpalatable flavored synthetic foods. They manufacturers have basically adapted to that bliss point that continues to move to higher and higher flavor intensities and sweetnesses, and to bring that back down. Maybe you rip off the Band-Aid and jump into only whole foods that are nutrient dense, or maybe you just continue to add more and progressively change it down. But definitely people get to a point where they go, well, I really enjoy this food now. It's not just, I have to eat this food because it's good for me, and I hate it. If you get food that is nutritious, whole food that actually contains the nutrients, you get to a point where your body goes, I really dig that. I really like it. And if you've got veggies that taste like garbage, then they're probably, they probably don't contain the nutrients you're looking for. And if you get those fresh local foods that are grown well in good soil, you're probably going to get a whole lot of nutrients that make it taste a whole lot better. So nutrients is nutrient dense food tends to taste really good, and if it doesn't taste good, then it's probably not going to be good for you. But there's definitely an adaptation period when it's basically food porn, literally. That it's been amped up. It's not real. It's not a thing. It's just it's a flavor. People have worked out how to hyper flavor our food in a way over the last 50 years by creating synthetic chemicals that mimic nutrition in food.
Have you noticed with yourself that it actually works in the opposite direction too? So you've been eating a nutrient-dense diet for a while, then you have some like ice cream or donuts and you're like, holy shit, that is so intense. Like it's over the top.
Totally. It's over sweet and you go, wow. But but those foods always taste good and are easy to overeat, and we're just programmed to survive and thrive in an environment where winter is always coming. But winter, basically autumn is always here these days, and winter never comes because there's chronically food available. It's cheap, it's easy, it's always there, whether it's on the desk at work that somebody's bought some pies or cookies or whatever, and for some celebration it's always there, it's always available. And it's a challenge to say, no, I'm going to prioritize those nutrient dense whole foods early in the day. You get that protein, you get the nutritious food, and then hopefully you then go, well, I don't need that anymore because I feel good. I've had my fill.
Right. Now, I've heard you talk about how the body tends to crave what it needs. So, for example, reaching for a large serving of protein after a hard workout where a bunch of muscle damage occurred. So some folks tend to eat the same foods for, say, a month or two every day, and then switch things up and eat a different group of foods for, I don't know, a month or so, et cetera, et cetera. But then there are another group of people that seem to need to vary things on almost like a daily meal-to-meal basis. Now, I'm not aware of any research that's been done in this area, but do you have any theories on like why this could be? Do we chalk it up to individual variability? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, I suppose personally, when you've done a workout, you'd go, or you've done like I was talking to you before about doing high volume workouts, your body just says, I need food now, I need energy dense food, but and you're craving the cream or the peanut butter or the donuts or whatever just to get that energy back in. But when you're more sedentary, the body naturally doesn't necessarily crave as much of the protein or the energy dense food, and you can get away with just focusing on nutrient dense whole foods that are higher in protein, but you don't really need that much protein to be satisfied if you're not really active. There's fascinating experiments. I think it's called Clara's Kids back in the 30s, where they had an orphanage where they gave these kids about 35 nutritious whole foods, and they all went and selected their own choices of different foods that perfectly suited their needs at the time. And one kid had rickets, so they got into the cod liver oil for a month and healed their own rickets, and all of a sudden they didn't crave that food anymore. And there's definitely, when we're left to our own devices, and I think once we get rid of that overstimulation, that literal food porn that desensitizes us to our ability to sense nutrients in food, we learn to be self-guided. And I suppose that's where the nutrient optimizer tries to get rid of those hyperpalatable junk foods that aren't really real, that are just flavored to taste like they've got nutrients in them. And then you get rid of that, and people find a taste for it, and then they realize what nutrient density feels like and tastes like, and they start to enjoy it, and then they won't need that tool to guide them once the trainer wheels are off. But I think there's sort of a period of just about rehabilitation from the modern environment where people need to have those a guidance to say, okay, let's guide you towards the nutritious foods that contain the nutrients you're not getting at the moment. So yeah, exciting things happen when you do that.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Just sort of getting back to baseline first and foremost, and then building off of that. That's so. Let's say somebody switches to a super nutrient dense diet tomorrow from their sort of traditional diet. Are there any risks of potentially getting too much of certain nutrients, or does the body do a pretty good job of sorting all that stuff out? I mean, if they were tracking it with the nutrient optimizer, they could just see the info. But how does the body respond there?
Yeah, I mean, from whole foods, really, vitamin A is the only thing that I've heard, really, that people get if there's stories of Arctic explorers that are starving and kill a polar bear and eat the liver and get hypervitamin Aosis, but that's the only, from whole foods, it's the only, eating too much liver is really the only way you can get excess of nutrients from whole food. Generally, it's you can overdose in synthetic vitamins, but from whole food, it's really not a concern.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, the body's pretty smart.
Yeah. And if you focus on the nutrients that you're finding harder to get, all those other nutrients you're getting too much of work themselves out, and it's hard to get too much of those, especially when you're focusing on the ones that are harder to get.
Right. Now, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but vegetarian and vegan diets are at all-time high popularity-wise, and you talked about B12. Now, is there anything that folks who eat animal products versus a vegetarian and vegan diet approach should look out for as far as absorbing nutrients and being able to utilize what they're taking in?
Yeah, definitely B12 is a challenge. Vitamin A is a challenge for people on that vegetarian-type diet. And some, especially the vitamin A, is less bioavailable. So generally, if you're eating a omnivorous diet with animal and plant-based foods to some degree, I think you'd be in a pretty good place. And people definitely argue that you should be at one extreme or the other. But I think if you're somewhere in the middle on that spectrum, I don't really care whether you eat more plants or more animals. But if you're on that spectrum somewhere, then people do okay. But definitely if you're plant only, then you're going to be more challenged to get a number of nutrients that are less bioavailable, particularly the vitamin A.
Right. Okay.
And the B12.
Yeah, and maybe some like zinc, stuff like that, possibly. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, it's different forms that are harder to convert.
Cool. Now, humans tend to have fairly like proactive or additive minds, meaning when we have an issue like digestive distress, for example, we're like, okay, what should I eat to make this better? What should I take to get my digestion on track? And typically the answer is more times than not, it's like, don't do anything, just like don't eat anything. So let the body do its thing. Now, this stems into the thought that what we eat is really important. No one debates that. However, what we don't eat is probably equally as important. So is this something that you mention to folks with the nutrient optimizing stuff, or do you focus more on an inclusive approach and then solely recommend what to eat in hopes that these nutrients crowd out the less nutrient dense options?
Yeah, definitely. definitely the primary focus is on let's fill your plate, fill your life with real food that then crowds out those other things and the cravings disappear. But to some degree, you always need to look at calorie balance and getting enough protein. And if your blood sugars are elevated, then dialing down the carbohydrates. So that's sort of the second phase that we follow up with a smart macros algorithm that then says, hey, let's look at your protein, fat and carb intake and overall calorie intake, and if your weight isn't moving, if your blood sugars aren't moving in the right direction, if you're losing more lean muscle mass than fat, or you're gaining more fat than muscle, let's tweak those macronutrient profile targets to help you get there. But like you say, that the first step is the real food that contains the nutrients that generally works itself out. But some people need a little bit more dialing in, and you can follow up with that if you wanted to go to that level of tracking. So I suppose the overall challenge for us has been to make sure this is accessible for everybody that doesn't, not everybody's going to want to track everything they eat all the time, and that can be a real burden. You don't want to make people have to do that forever. You want to find a way to go, okay, maybe you need to track for a few days, a few weeks, and that can be a helpful training exercise, but you want to get people to the point of going, okay, I don't need this anymore, and here's a selection of foods, here's a selection of meals that I can focus on, and that's going to work out for me really well. But yeah, sometimes, depending on how intense people want to go with it, depending on how neurotic they are, how much effort they want to put in, how much they need it, how motivated they are. So there's different grades of optimization. But yeah, definitely you can follow up with tailoring in and dialing in your micronutrients and then macronutrients as well.
Cool, man. Now, I'd love to address salt intake because there's so much conflicting info around it. So how should folks think about it, especially if they choose to take a whole food nutrient dense approach, because these foods are inherently lower in sodium than like processed foods and stuff. So yeah, how do you think about that?
Oh yeah, fascinating topic. Yeah, definitely. I think people need more overall minerals, the calcium, sodium, potassium, and potassium, it tends to be the one that people don't get enough of, and in our modern diet we tend to get enough sodium. But definitely, as you say, when people go with a whole foods clean diet and they're not adding salt, then they tend to struggle to get enough salt, enough sodium sometimes. If you look at it from a ratios perspective, as a general rule of thumb, athletes who are really active, people who are moving a lot, sweating a lot, probably need about a 1-to-1 potassium-sodium ratio. Ideally, for people who aren't as active, they probably need twice as much potassium as sodium. And if you look, there's really no upper limit to how much potassium you can get. So the benefits keep on improving the more potassium you get, and our diet tends to be very, very low in potassium. I don't know if you've seen the Pure study. They did a study of the benefits of sodium, potassium, and there is definitely a U-shaped curve where if you get enough sodium, you sort of there's a golden zone that I think it's 3 to 4 grams a day in that. If you get enough sodium, your odds ratio are improved, but there's really no limit to the amount of potassium. As they got 4, 5, 6 grams of potassium a day, people's health continued to improve. And it's just because I think we don't get enough of that in our diet generally, because we're not eating a lot of green stuff, and it's not in our grains anymore. That isn't in our soil, in our food that is the same plot of land gets turned over again and again and again, year after year after year, decade after decade, and it's just depleted in our food system. So definitely we did a similar sodium analysis with satiety, and found that as you get more and more sodium, there's a point where your appetite improves and you're not craving as much sodium anymore. So there's definitely about 3, 4, 5 grams of sodium in your diet a day. It seems to switch off your appetite. So definitely getting enough sodium, and basically it comes down to salt to taste. So if you feel like adding salt to your food, then go for it, and it's probably good for you. But you'll get to a point where you go, that's too much salt. I don't need that much. I'm going to back it off. And you're basically salt to taste is the bottom line.
I love that. Yeah, salt to taste. So kind of pay attention to your taste buds on that front and trust yourself. Now, you and your wife have seen big improvements in energy, mood, general sense of well-being you mentioned, but I'm curious,
Definitely.
what sort of changes, if any, have you seen in your kids by implementing this nutrient-dense diet stuff from a physical standpoint, but then also have you noticed anything on like the learning and behavior end of things?
Yeah, wow. My wife, obviously with type 1, has got some autoimmune challenges, and the daughter has had some gut issues and challenges with wheat-based things. So daughter doesn't do well with gluten, and she's found that. And it's just great. Lately, they've started lifting and getting strong, and they go to the friends' parties and taste the food and go, yeah, that really doesn't taste good. I really don't want that pizza. I really wanted the steak and veggies, and they really enjoy whole food and treat that sort of junk food as a recreational drug now, which is really nice. And they know the value of how they respond to different foods, and they know they don't feel good after those foods because they, as a baseline, we eat fairly well and robust food. They know that when they have that junk food, they don't thrive. And especially that the son, when he has colours or sugars, he goes off and doesn't think as well, and mood degrades. And so it's really interesting to see in the kids how they definitely react in different ways, but definitely if you've got that baseline of healthy foods, you can really see when they have those other foods, they're going, I don't really feel good, I probably won't do that again too often. So
that's awesome, man. Now, just for context, how old are your kids? And then also, is this something that they came to on their own, or did you kind of like plant the seed on this with this sort of stuff? They notice that these foods don't make them feel good and these other ones do.
Son's 13 and daughter's 14. They've basically grown up around it as we've taken this journey over the last 8 or 10 years. The daughter's health has definitely improved, and we've definitely tried to actively, because we've seen what happens to our son when he has these not so good foods and he doesn't feel so good, doesn't think so well, and we need to actively manage that and try to diminish those opportunities for those junky foods. But at the same time, it's interesting to try and feed kids in the real world in a hyperpalatable food environment. You've just got to choose well. I suppose it's nature and nurture at the same time, and they see what we do and experience it. And every time we sit down for a meal, it's generally a robust, healthy set of food choices. But it's been interesting through the nutrient optimizer challenge I was talking to you about before, when Moni and I jumped into let's maximize our nutrient density and satiety, going from that baseline of a lower carb nutrient dense diet to let's max out satiety and nutrient density and see what happens. It really took it to another level from that baseline, which was a fascinating experience for both of us when we actually implemented the numerically optimizing satiety in real life for both of us. So that was fascinating at the same time, just in our own lives as well. So.
Yeah, man, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your experience with that personally. So you're so educated on this nutrient optimization stuff. Now, I think folks will want to know, how does a typical day look for you nutrition-wise? What are you eating on a sort of standard day?
Yeah. It's good to get a few baseline foods that work for you, that you enjoy. And for us during the challenge, particularly, getting an omelette with some egg, but also egg white tends to be more satiating because it's got a lower fat content, tends to fill you up. And so throw in some fish and some spinach, and that was sort of breakfast a lot of the time, and then would come with a tuna or mackerel and salad lunch, and then just basically steak and veggies or fish and veggies or those sorts of things for dinner. And that was the general fare, and very filling, very satisfying, very colourful, and very tasty. But when we focused on saying, well, this is the only foods we're going to have over that 6 weeks, it did really well and thrived and lost a lot of weight if we just focused on exclusively those foods and being really disciplined.
And so it was like very, very low carb then? Carbs were just sort of limited, like starches were cut out and fruit was cut out, or?
Yeah. Well, the starchy veggies, the potatoes. Potatoes are interesting because if you only eat potatoes with no fat, they tend to be very satiating. But once you combine them with the butter and the oil and it's basically create a French fry and add some salt, and then it's very hyper palatable. And it's that combination. So as long as you avoid that middle ground, you tend to do really well. But personally, in my own life, I'm not really particularly afraid of carbohydrates as far as veggies, and if I'm recovering from a workout and my blood sugars are under control, then some potatoes are fine. We tend to feed the son a few potatoes because he's just so energetic and eats so much, and it's like, let's find something cheap and cost effective to feed him to fill him up, and he enjoys that. But we try not to combine that with the oil, which tends to just make it junky and hyperpalatable and potentially fattening, and even for a 13-year-old boy, that can be a challenge as well. So,
right. So just managing the balance of caloric intake within the carbohydrate, the fat, and then focusing on the protein, veggies more so. Gotcha. Gotcha. So, man, as we start to wrap up here, before we get to the end of the show, where can folks find your work online? Is there anything that we didn't mention today that you'd like to mention or leave the listeners with? Any of that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So optimizingnutrition.com is my blog where I've got long articles sort of delving into this stuff a little bit more. Then there's nutrientoptimizer.com, which is the tool we're building to try and implement this. So people can go there and do a free report which gives them macros and macro targets for their goals and food and meal options for them to jump into that they can start the nutrient-dense journey with that. And I've got a few Facebook groups. Nutrient Optimizer is sort of the group where people get, share their nutrient-dense meals, and this is what I ate today, and this is the nutrient score of it. And it's really great. I'm so buzzed to see people sharing all their journey and doing really well. And then there's an Optimizing Nutrition Facebook group, which gets into the weeds and people sharing studies and getting into the latest research, which is also interesting but very different. So, and we've got a Nutrient Optimizer Nutrient Density Challenge coming up. So we basically say, hey, if you want to prove you've got the most nutrient-dense diet, we'll give you basically training over 3 weeks to take you through a bit of a journey to teach you how to optimize your diet, and then in that last week take photos of all your food and put it up on the group, and we'll have cash prizes for people who get the highest nutrient score at the end of that. So basically people contribute to a prize pool if they want cash prizes, and we don't care if you're omnivore or carnivore or paleo or ketogenic or whatever you want to call your diet. We just want to see which one has got the most nutrients and what that looks like, and excited about that. So that's probably going to kick off in about 3 weeks from now. So if they sign up with the free report, we'll send them an email once that's ready to jump on.
That's awesome, dude. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. Thanks so much for taking the time, Marty. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Marty Kendall. Thank you so much for listening. And if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching or workout design, you can check out the website at n1fitness.com, which is linked below. Or you can also follow me on Instagram at n1fitness. And feel free to friend me up at Marcus Sadu on Facebook as well. I'll catch you guys on the next episode. See ya.